Have you ever had someone look right through you, past the person you are, and see only a stereotype they've concocted in their own narrow mind? It's a uniquely infuriating experience, a feeling of being simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. For me, that feeling arrived in a flurry of pastel-colored stationery, tucked under the windshield wiper of my car, written in a loopy, aggressive cursive. The note informed me that my trash receptacles were placed a full 6 inches too close to the curb, and that this blatant disregard for community aesthetics was unacceptable. This was my introduction to Carol, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, and the beginning of a conflict she was monumentally unprepared to win. My name is Maya, and by trade, I'm a forensic accountant. My world is one of numbers, patterns, and the stories hidden within financial statements. I trace money, uncover fraud, and build narratives from spreadsheets that can make or break fortunes. It's a high-stress, high-stakes job, which is why I bought my house in Willow Creek. It was advertised as a sanctuary, a quiet, meticulously maintained enclave where I could decompress, tend to my garden, and forget about the corporate dragons I slayed from Monday to Friday. All I wanted was peace. I wanted to sit on my porch with a glass of iced tea and listen to the birds, not the incessant whining of a neighborhood tyrant. But from the moment I moved in, it was clear that my presence, the presence of a black woman in her late 30s who drove a nice car and clearly wasn't a domestic worker, was a disruption to Carol's carefully curated world. The trash can note was just the opening salvo. It was followed by complaints about the length of my grass, a 1/4 inch over regulation, the unapproved color of my welcome mat, and the supposed noise violation of my classical music playing at a volume barely audible from my own driveway. Each complaint was delivered with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She saw a young black woman and assumed I was a renter, a transient who didn't belong and could be easily intimidated. During one of our more memorable encounters, after she'd called the city about my unauthorized rose bushes, she puffed up her chest and delivered the line she thought was her trump card. "You know," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I have a great deal of influence on the board. We don't tolerate people who can't follow the rules here. It would be a shame if your landlord were to find out you're a problematic tenant. We can have people like you removed," she smiled, thinking she had me cornered, that the threat of eviction would send me scrambling to obey her every petty whim. What Carol didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend in her prejudiced little worldview, was that she was threatening to have me evicted from a community where her own fate rested squarely in the palm of my hand. She had no idea that while I owned the house I lived in, my portfolio of real estate investments, the very source of the wealth she couldn't imagine me possessing, also included the charming little Cape Cod she called home. She wasn't just my neighbor, she was my tenant. And as a forensic accountant, I knew better than anyone that when someone shows you who they are, you should run the numbers. Her mistake wasn't just underestimating me. It was giving me a reason to open her file. Have you ever had to deal with someone who simply refuses to listen to reason? That was the brick wall I hit when I first tried to resolve the Carol situation diplomatically. This story is about what happens when diplomacy fails and a person's own arrogance becomes the instrument of their downfall. It's a long and detailed account, but I promise you, the finale is worth every single word. My initial approach was to be the bigger person, the reasonable adult in a situation orchestrated by a petty tyrant. I believe, perhaps naively, that the system, in this case the HOA board, would function as designed. I drafted a polite, factual email to the board outlining the series of unwarranted complaints and the escalating harassment from Carol. I attached photos with timestamps. My trash cans placed perfectly, a ruler showing my grass height was compliant, a decibel meter app showing my music was quieter than the ambient cicadas. I requested a simple mediation, a conversation to clarify the rules and put a stop to the targeted pestering. I was asking for the peace and quiet I was paying a premium for. The response I received a week later was a masterclass in passive-aggressive dismissal. It was a form letter signed by the board president, a man named Bob who I later learned was Carol's staunchest ally. The letter stated that the board had reviewed the matter and found that Carol was simply performing her duties as a concerned homeowner and a member of the Architectural Review Committee. It gently suggested that new residents sometimes find the high standards of Willow Creek to be an adjustment, and included a freshly printed copy of the 300-page book of covenants and restrictions. They weren't just ignoring my complaint. They were validating her behavior and painting me as the problem. They were patting me on the head and telling me to learn my place. This response was a green light for Carol. Her campaign of petty torment intensified exponentially. She started following me when I went for my morning walks, a clipboard in hand, openly taking notes. She'd stand on the sidewalk and stare at my house for unnervingly long periods. Her complaints became more frequent and more absurd. She filed a formal grievance that the light from my reading lamp, visible through my second-story window, was aesthetically disruptive to the nighttime streetscape. She accused me of running a business from my home because a courier delivered a work package one afternoon. The racial undertones, once subtle, became overt. During a particularly heated exchange over the placement of a garden gnome she deemed tacky, she let the mask slip completely. "I don't know what kind of neighborhood you're used to," she sneered, her face pinched with disdain. "But here we have standards. This isn't the inner city. We take pride in our community, and we don't appreciate people coming in and dragging it down." The message was crystal clear. My crime wasn't a misplaced gnome. It was my very existence in her pristine, monochromatic world. The final straw was when she escalated beyond the HOA. She started trying to involve my landlord. She left a note on my door, this time typed and in a business envelope, addressed to the property owner, detailed a fabricated list of lease violations, unauthorized occupants. I'd had my sister over for dinner, property damage of blatant lie, and repeated rule breaking. The letter concluded with a chilling sentence. "As a board member, I am formally requesting that you begin eviction proceedings against your tenant, Maya Johnson, for failure to comply with the community's mandatory covenants. Her continued presence is detrimental to property values. She was actively trying to make me homeless because she didn't like the color of my skin. She had no idea she was sending that request indirectly to me." That was the moment the frustrated, peace-seeking Maya receded and the forensic accountant took over. The part of my brain that sees everything as a system to be analyzed, a puzzle to be solved, lit up. Carol and her cronies on the board had rebuffed reason. They had spit on diplomacy. They had made it personal. Fine. I would respond in the only language they seemed to understand, the cold, hard, and unforgiving language of contractual obligations, financial accountability, and leverage power. She wanted to play a game of rules and consequences. She was about to find out that I owned the whole damn casino. The switch didn't flip with a dramatic crash. It was more like the quiet, satisfying click of a deadbolt sliding into place. The frustration that had been simmering within me for weeks didn't boil over into rage. Instead, it crystallized into a cold, sharp-edged resolve. Carol wanted to talk about rules, about landlords and tenants, about compliance and consequences. Excellent. Let's have that conversation. I went into my home office, the space where I untangled the most complex financial knots for my clients, and for the first time, I turned that intense focus onto my own life. My first step was to confirm the obvious, but in my line of work, you never assume. You verify. I logged into the asset management portal for my real estate holding company, a small LLC I'd set up years ago to keep my investments separate and legally firewalled. I navigated to the portfolio of single-family rental properties I'd acquired in a bulk deal 2 years prior. The properties were managed by a large, rather impersonal firm, Main Street Realty. Their job was to collect rent, handle minor repairs, and generally keep the income stream flowing with minimal input from me. It was a passive investment, and I'd intended to keep it that way. I pulled up the file for the property at 128 Azalea Lane, Willow Creek. And there she was, Carol Peterson, tenant of record for the past 4 years. The lease was a standard 12-month agreement, currently on a month-to-month basis after the initial term had expired. A jolt, a strange mix of vindication and dark humor, shot through me. It was real. The woman trying to have me kicked out of my own home was, in fact, paying my mortgage. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. She was unknowingly funding the very lifestyle she found so offensive. The monthly rent payment that landed in my LLC's bank account contributed to the down payment on my own beautiful home in her precious neighborhood. She was the author of her own misery, and she didn't even know it. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. This changed everything. I wasn't just a homeowner fighting an HOA. I was a landlord with a problematic tenant. A problematic tenant who was also the chief instigator of a campaign of harassment against me in my other capacity as a private resident. It was a beautifully complicated, legally fascinating mess, and I suddenly felt a surge of professional enthusiasm. I downloaded the entire file from Main Street Realty's portal. The original lease agreement, all subsequent addendums, the full payment ledger, and every piece of correspondence on record. I was no longer just Maya, the annoyed neighbor. I was Maya, a beneficial owner, and I was conducting an audit. I spent the next hour reading every line of her lease. It was a standard, boilerplate document, but within that dry legalese lay the seeds of Carol's undoing. I highlighted 3 key sections. First, the clause on timely rent payments, which stipulated that rent was due on the first of the month and a late fee of 5% would be assessed after a 5-day grace period. Second, the section on nuisance and community conduct, a broad but powerful clause that stated the tenant must not engage in any behavior that disturbs the peace, quiet, and enjoyment of the community for other residents. It explicitly mentioned harassment of neighbors as a material breach of the lease. Third, the termination clause, which outlined the conditions under which the landlord could issue a notice of non-renewal or, in severe cases, begin eviction proceedings. A material breach of any covenant in the lease was grounds for termination. I then turned my attention to the payment ledger, and that's when my smile widened. Carol, the woman so obsessed with enforcing rules to the letter, was a terrible rule follower herself. Over the past 24 months, she had been late with her rent 18 times. Not just a day or two late, but consistently paying between the 10th and 15th of the month. Yet, not once had a late fee been assessed. Main Street Realty, in their quest for passive efficiency, had clearly decided it wasn't worth the hassle. As long as the money eventually showed up, they were content. They were lazy. This laziness was about to become a very powerful tool. Carol had been living in a world without consequences. I was about to introduce her to the concept of accountability with interest. My focus, now razor-sharp, expanded from Carol's tenancy to the larger entity that enabled her, the Willow Creek HOA. In my experience, where there's one cockroach, there's usually a nest. Carol's power didn't exist in a vacuum. It was granted, or at least tolerated, by the board. As a homeowner and a paying member of the association, I had a legal right to inspect its financial records. It was time to see if the HOA's books were as pristine as their manicured lawns. I started with the publicly available documents on the community website, the annual budget, the minutes from the last few board meetings, and the most recent reserve study. To a layperson, it would have been an exercise in boredom, a collection of dry figures and procedural jargon. To me, it was a treasure map. The first red flag was in the budget. Under the line item for landscaping services, the figure was nearly 40% higher than comparable communities of our size and standard, a fact I quickly verified by cross-referencing public budgets from several similar HOAs in the county. It was an exorbitant amount. I scrolled through the meeting minutes, searching for any discussion about landscaping contracts. I found it. A year ago, the board, led by a motion from Carol, had voted to terminate their contract with a large, reputable landscaping company and award a new, exclusive contract to a small, newly formed company, Peterson Lawn and Garden. The name was almost laughably brazen. A quick search of the state's business registry confirmed my suspicion. The sole proprietor of Peterson Lawn and Garden was one Dale Peterson, Carol's brother-in-law. The contract had been awarded without a competitive bidding process, a clear violation of the HOA's own bylaws, which stipulated that any contract over $10,000 required at least 3 competing bids. The landscaping contract was for $150,000 a year. This wasn't just poor governance. This was blatant cronyism, a textbook case of self-dealing. Carol was using the HOA's money to enrich her own family, and the rest of the board was either too incompetent to notice or too complacent to care. My next target was the reserve fund, the pot of money set aside for major long-term repairs like paving roads, replacing roofs on common buildings, and painting. The reserve study, an official report commissioned every few years to determine if the fund was adequate, was 5 years out of date. The bylaws mandated a new study every 3 years. The existing funds were dangerously low, well below the recommended level for a community of our age and size. Meanwhile, the operating budget was bloated with vague expenses like administrative consulting, community engagement supplies, and compliance committee discretionary funds. That last one was Carol's personal slush fund. It was a slush fund she was using to pay for her reams of pastel stationery and the ink she used to write her harassing little notes. I was literally paying for the weapons being used against me. The picture was becoming devastatingly clear. Carol wasn't just a racist busybody. She was at the center of a web of financial mismanagement, using her position on the board to line her family's pockets and fund her personal fiefdom, all while the community's long-term financial health was being jeopardized. Her obsession with petty violations wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about wielding power. It was a smokescreen to make her seem diligent and essential, distracting everyone from the real violations happening right under their noses in the ledger books. She counted on the fact that no one was looking. She counted on the fact that no one knew how to look. But now someone was. And that someone was a forensic accountant whom she had personally targeted, harassed, and tried to have evicted. She had made the single greatest miscalculation of her life. She thought she was fighting a nuisance tenant. She had no idea she had declared war on an auditor. The scope of my plan began to broaden. This was no longer just about getting Carol to leave me alone. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt structure she had built around herself. It was about restoring not just my own peace, but the integrity of the whole community. She wanted to talk about rules. I was about to hold her and the entire board accountable to every single one they had so conveniently ignored. With a complete picture of the battlefield laid out before me, I began to formulate my strategy. It would not be a single swift strike, but a multi-phase campaign designed to systematically dismantle Carol's power, expose her hypocrisy, and remove her from my life and my property. It was a plan built on the principles of my profession: documentation, precision, and the methodical application of pressure. I named it Operation Nightingale, a nod to the quiet street I lived on and the justice I intended to sing. The plan had 3 distinct, yet interconnected, phases. Phase 1, the tenant squeeze. This was the most direct and personal phase. Carol's sense of untouchability stemmed from her belief that she was a homeowner in good standing. I would shatter that illusion by reminding her of her true status, a tenant with a history of lease violations. Her lazy property management company, Main Street Realty, was the weak link I needed to exploit. They had enabled her delinquency. I would now force them to be the instruments of my discipline. My first call would be to the regional manager of Main Street Realty, not as a tenant, but as the beneficial owner of the LLC that held the title to 128 Azalea Lane. I would be polite but firm, expressing my disappointment in their lax enforcement of my lease agreements. I would instruct them, in writing, that effective immediately, all lease terms were to be enforced to the absolute letter across my entire portfolio, with a special focus on the Azalea Lane property. No more unwritten grace periods. Rent due on the 1st, late fee notice sent on the 6th, no exceptions. Furthermore, I would instruct them to begin documenting any and all community-related complaints associated with the tenant, referencing the nuisance and community conduct clause. Carol's harassment of me, her neighbor, would now be officially recorded in her tenant file. Phase 2, the HOA audit offensive. This phase would attack Carol's public power base. Her authority was derived from her position on the HOA board and the perception that she was a diligent steward of the community. I would demolish that perception by exposing the financial rot she was presiding over. I would draft a formal, legally sound petition to the HOA board. It wouldn't be a complaint, it would be a demand, citing my rights as a homeowner under the state's Condominium Act and the HOA's own bylaws. I would demand a full, independent forensic audit of the association's finances for the past 3 years. I wouldn't make vague accusations. I would present a preliminary memorandum, my appetizer of findings. It would highlight the non-competitive landscaping contract awarded to her brother-in-law, the dangerously underfunded reserve account, the outdated reserve study, and the questionable discretionary spending. This would do 2 things. It would show the board I was not just some angry resident, but someone with expertise, and it would put them in a legally precarious position. Refusing a well-founded demand for an audit would open them up to personal liability. It would force them to act, and in doing so, would inevitably lead to a public meeting where these issues would have to be discussed. Phase 3, the public checkmate. This would be the culmination of my efforts, the stage for the final public confrontation. Carol and the board, reeling from the pressure of the audit demand and the sudden enforcement of her lease, would likely try to discredit me. They would almost certainly call the special meeting she had threatened, the one to discuss my violations and pressure my landlord to evict me. This was the trap. I would let them set the stage, build the gallows they thought were for me. I would attend that meeting, not as a defendant, but as the closing argument in my own case. I would let Carol give her smug, self-righteous speech. I would let the board president nod along in agreement. And then, when it was my turn to speak, I would not defend myself against their petty, fabricated claims. Instead, I would execute the checkmate. I would have a projector and screen set up. I would begin by introducing myself, Maya Johnson, owner of 212 Nightingale Drive. Then I would project the deed and LLC ownership documents for 128 Azalea Lane, clearly showing my company as the owner. I would calmly introduce myself as Carol Peterson's landlord. In the ensuing silence, I would have a professional process server seated discreetly in the audience stand up and serve Carol with a formal, non-negotiable 30-day notice of non-renewal of her lease, citing her history of late payments and her material breach of the Community Conduct Clause. Finally, with her personal credibility shattered, I would pivot to the larger issue, the financial health of the community. I would present my audit demand to the assembled homeowners, laying out the evidence of cronyism and mismanagement. I would turn Carol's hearing into a referendum on her and the board's fitness to lead. It was a comprehensive, interlocking plan. Each phase was designed to amplify the others. The tenant squeeze would rattle her personally, making her more likely to make mistakes. The audit demand would dismantle her professional credibility, and the public meeting would be the stage for her complete and total humiliation. She wanted to evict me? I was going to architect her exile. The first domino was ready to fall. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the regional manager of Main Street Realty, a man named Gerald Fleming. It was time to put phase 1 into motion. When his assistant put me through, I introduced myself clearly and professionally. Mr. Fleming, my name is Maya Johnson. I am the principal of Nightingale Equity, LLC. Your firm manages a portfolio of properties for my company. There was a brief silence, then the sound of frantic typing. His tone shifted immediately from bored bureaucrat to attentive servant. Ms. Johnson, yes, of course. It's a pleasure to finally speak with you. I hope everything is to your satisfaction. I let the silence hang for a moment before replying, my voice calm and measured. Actually, Gerald, it's not. I've just concluded a review of my portfolio's performance and an audit of several tenant files, and I've identified some significant administrative lapses. Specifically, regarding the property at 128 Azalea Lane in the Willow Creek development, more typing. The Peterson lease, he said. A long-term tenant. Is there an issue? I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, wondering what he had missed. The issue, Gerald, I said, my voice hardening slightly, is that my tenant has been late on her rent 18 of the last 24 months, yet your firm has failed to assess a single contractually obligated late fee. You have also failed to document a series of community conduct violations, which I have been personally tracking. My investment is predicated on the strict enforcement of the legal agreements you are paid to administer. This laxity is unacceptable. He began to stammer, offering apologies and excuses about staff turnover and wanting to maintain good tenant relationships. I cut him off. Your priority is not the tenant's relationship. It is your fiduciary duty to me, the owner. Effective immediately, that changes. I'm sending you a formal directive via email. All leases under my LLC are to be enforced to the absolute letter. No exceptions. No verbal warnings. No anditen gracias. For the Azalea Lane property, I want a formal notice of late payment sent by certified mail if the rent is not received by the 5th of the month. Every single time. Furthermore, I want you to open a file on community conduct for this tenant. I will be forwarding you documented evidence of harassment. You will log it and issue a formal warning letter to the tenant, referencing the nuisance clause in her lease. A warning letter? He squeaked, clearly terrified of confronting a tenant. Yes, Gerald. That is what I said. You will do your job, as stipulated in our management contract. Are we clear? He mumbled his assent, and I hung up. Within 5 minutes, I had sent the formal, legally binding email directive. The machine was now in motion. The 1st of the month came and went. Then the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. On the morning of the 6th, exactly as I had instructed, Main Street Realty generated a formal letter and a 5% late fee assessment, which was sent via email and certified mail to Carol Peterson at 128 Azalea Lane. The effect was immediate. Around noon that day, I was in my garden when I saw Carol march out to her mailbox. She pulled out the contents, flipped through them, and froze. She stared at the certified mail slip, then at the envelope from Main Street Realty. Her face, usually a mask of smug superiority, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She stomped back into her house, slamming the door so hard that one of my windows rattled. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I let go to voicemail. The message, when I listened to it, was from a sputtering Carol. Maya, I don't know what you did, but I just got a ridiculous letter from my property manager. After 4 years of perfect tenancy, this has your fingerprints all over it. You think you can bully me? You have no idea who you're dealing with. This is harassment. The irony was breathtaking. She, who had been systematically harassing me for weeks, was now accusing me of harassment for simply enforcing the terms of her own lease. Her assumption that I was somehow responsible was both a testament to her narcissism and a perfect confirmation that my strategy was working. It was rattling her. That evening, I received another gift. A formal violation notice from the HOA, signed by Carol, was taped to my front door. The violation? Improperly stored gardening equipment. My small, decorative watering can was sitting next to a potted geranium on my porch. The notice stated I had 24 hours to remedy the situation or face a fine. It was petty, it was vindictive, and it was exactly what I wanted. I took a photo of a notice next to the watering can, saved it with a timestamp, and drafted an email. Subject: documentation for tenant file 128 Azalea Lane. Dear Mr. Fleming, I wrote, please find attached further evidence of the tenant's continued breach of the community conduct clause. This is a copy of a retaliatory and frivolous violation notice issued to me by the tenant in her capacity as an HOA committee member, constituting targeted harassment. Please add this to her file and include it as justification in the next formal warning letter. Thank you. Maya Johnson. Phase 1 was not only working, it was creating the very evidence I needed to justify Phase 3. Carol thought she was fighting back, but all she was doing was loading the gun. I was aiming squarely at her future. With Carol thoroughly rattled and her tenant file growing thicker by the day, it was time to initiate Phase 2. The moment had come to shift the battlefield from our front yards to the HOA's boardroom and balance sheets. I spent a weekend meticulously crafting the document that would serve as my declaration of war, the formal demand for a forensic audit. This was not a simple letter of complaint. It was a surgical instrument designed to be undeniable and legally intimidating. I structured it like a preliminary report I would present to a corporate client. It began with a clear statement of purpose, citing the specific articles in both the HOA bylaws and the state property code that granted me, as a homeowner, the right to inspect all financial records and to petition for an audit if reasonable cause was shown. The next section was titled Areas of Concern, where I laid out my initial findings in cold, hard, factual terms. I didn't use emotional language or make personal accusations. I just presented the data. I detailed the landscaping contract awarded to Peterson Lawn and Garden, noting its value, the lack of a competitive bidding process as required by Bylaw 142, and the familial relationship between the vendor and a board member. I included a comparative analysis chart showing how our landscaping costs were 40% above market rate. Next, I addressed the reserve fund. I cited the legal requirement for a new reserve study every 3 years and pointed out that the current study was 62 months old, a direct violation. I calculated the current funding level against the recommendations of the old study and projected a significant shortfall using industry standard formulas. I wrote, "The board's failure to maintain an adequate reserve study and funding plan constitutes a potential breach of its fiduciary duty to protect and maintain the community's assets." Finally, I dissected the operating budget. I flagged several line items with vague descriptions and unusually high expenditures, including the Compliance Committee discretionary fund, and formally requested a detailed transaction history for these accounts. I concluded the document with a formal demand. In light of these significant and well-documented irregularities, I, Maya Johnson, homeowner at 212 Nightingale Drive, do hereby formally petition the board to commission a full, independent forensic audit of the association's financial record for the fiscal years 2021, 2022, and 2023. Failure to act on this reasonable and evidence-based request may result in further legal action to compel compliance and hold the board members personally liable for any financial malfeasance uncovered. I printed 2 copies. One I would send via certified mail to the HOA's official address. The other I would deliver by hand. On Monday morning, I walked to the home of Bob, the board president. I rang his doorbell, and after a moment, he answered, a look of mild annoyance on his face that deepened when he saw it was me. "Ms. Johnson," he said curtly. "Good morning, Bob." I replied, my voice even and pleasant. "I'm delivering a copy of a formal petition I've just sent to the board via certified mail. I wanted to ensure you received it personally and understood its gravity." I handed him the envelope. He took it hesitantly, his eyes narrowing. He tore it open and began to read. I watched as the color drained from his face. His folksy, dismissive demeanor evaporated, replaced by a pallor of genuine fear. He was a retired sales manager, not a financial wizard. He likely had no idea about the specifics of what Carol was doing, but he knew enough to recognize the terms breach of fiduciary duty and personally liable. He looked up at me, his mouth slightly agape. This is an attack on the board. On our volunteers," he stammered. "No, Bob," I said calmly. "This is a request for transparency. It's a request to ensure our money is being spent properly and that our community's financial future is secure. As a homeowner, I'm sure you want the same thing." I didn't wait for a response. I just turned and walked away, leaving him standing in his doorway, holding the document like it was a live grenade. The fallout was swift. 2 days later, an email went out to the entire community. It announced an emergency homeowners meeting to be held the following week. The stated agenda was twofold. 1, to address a series of serious and unfounded allegations made against the board. 2, to discuss ongoing community compliance issues and resident conduct they had taken the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. They were calling my public checkmate for me. The unfounded allegations was my audit demand. The resident conduct was their planned public shaming of me. Carol's name wasn't on the email, but her fingerprints were all over its defensive, aggressive tone. She thought this meeting would be her stage to discredit me, to paint me as a malicious outsider and rally the community around her and the board. She believed they would successfully pressure my landlord into silence or action. The tension in the neighborhood became palpable. Neighbors who used to wave now averted their eyes. I could feel the community fracturing into factions. Some saw me as a troublemaker, while others, who had likely had their own run-ins with Carol, looked at me with a newfound, hopeful curiosity. They didn't know the specifics, but they could smell the smoke. They knew a confrontation was coming. Let them talk. Let them choose sides. They were all about to be front-row witnesses to the implosion of Carol Peterson's world. The stage was set. The actors were in place. All I had to do was walk on and deliver my lines. The night of the emergency meeting, the community clubhouse was buzzing with a nervous, electric energy. It was packed, far more crowded than any typical HOA meeting. Word had clearly spread that this was not going to be a boring discussion about pool hours or holiday decorations. This was a showdown. I chose a seat in the second row, directly in the center, ensuring I had a clear view of the board members seated at a long table at the front, and more importantly, that they had a clear view of me. I placed my leather briefcase on the floor beside me. Inside were my prepared remarks, copies of all my evidence, and a small, powerful projector. In the back corner of the room, looking like just another resident, sat a man in a nondescript polo shirt. This was Mr. Davis, a licensed process server I had hired for the evening. He and I made brief, imperceptible eye contact. He was ready. The meeting was called to order by Bob, the board president. He looked stressed, his face glistening with a thin sheen of sweat under the fluorescent lights. He launched into a rambling, defensive opening statement, talking about the thankless job of serving on the board and how they were all just volunteers working for the good of the community. Then he turned the floor over to Carol. She rose to her feet, a smug, triumphant smile plastered on her face. She was in her element, the center of attention, the righteous defender of Willow Creek's high standards. She held a stack of my pastel color violation notices in her hand like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Fellow homeowners," she began, her voice resonating with false sincerity. "I know we all work hard to keep our community beautiful and safe. It's what makes Willow Creek special. But recently, we've had a resident move in who simply refuses to respect our shared values and rules." She didn't use my name, but every head in the room turned toward me. I met their gazes with a calm, unblinking stare. "There have been repeated violations," she continued, "from something as simple as trash can placement to a complete disregard for our landscaping ordinances. When approached politely, this resident has been hostile and uncooperative." She was painting a picture of me as an unruly, aggressive troublemaker. The irony was suffocating. "But it's more than that," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This individual has now launched a baseless, malicious attack on your board, making wild accusations to try and intimidate us. This is not the kind of behavior we can tolerate in Willow Creek." She paused for dramatic effect, then delivered what she believed would be the killing blow. "This resident is a renter. They have no long-term investment in our community. I have personally been in contact with the property management company, and I have urged them to take action. I am asking the board tonight to formally draft a letter to this resident's landlord, demanding that they begin eviction proceedings. We must send a message that this kind of behavior will not stand." A smattering of applause broke out from her loyalists. Carol beamed, soaking it in. She looked directly at me, her eyes glittering with victory. She thought she had won. She thought I was finished. Bob cleared his throat. "Thank you, Carol. Now, before we move to a vote on that motion, the resident in question, Ms. Maya Johnson, has requested time to speak." All eyes swung back to me. I stood up slowly, picked up my briefcase, and walked to the front of the room. I set up my projector on a small table and aimed it at the blank wall behind the board members. I turned it on, and a bright, clear image appeared. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady and clear, amplified by the room's acoustics. "My name is Maya Johnson, and I live at 212 Nightingale Drive. I am the homeowner Carol was just referring to." I clicked a button on my remote. The first slide appeared on the wall. It was a high-resolution image of the deed for my house, with my name clearly visible as the owner. To correct the first of many inaccuracies you've heard tonight, I am not a renter. I am a homeowner, just like most of you. There was a murmur in the crowd. Carol's face tightened. But tonight isn't about the petty and false violations Carol has accused me of. I continued, my voice calm. It's about a much larger issue of rules, responsibilities, and who is truly fit to enforce them. Carol is correct about one thing. She has been in contact with a property management company about a tenant, and she has demanded that this tenant be evicted. I clicked the remote again. The next slide filled the wall. It was the official title record for 128 Azalea Lane. Displayed in large, undeniable text was the name of the owner, Nightingale Equity LLC. I clicked again. The next slide showed the state registration for Nightingale Equity LLC. In the box marked Principal was my name, Maya Johnson. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was a physical, audible shockwave. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Carol, whose face had gone from smug to ashen white. Her mouth was hanging open, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. "Carol," I said, my voice devoid of malice but dripping with finality. "I'm your landlord." The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shock. Every person was frozen, their eyes darting between the projection on the wall, my calm demeanor, and Carol's crumbling facade. She looked like she had been physically struck, her entire reality reordered in a single, brutal moment. Her power, her authority, her whole identity as the Queen of Willow Creek had been predicated on the belief that she was a peer among homeowners, a ruler in a kingdom of her equals. In the space of 10 seconds, I had revealed her to be a tenant, a subject, and worse, a delinquent one. I let the silence stretch, allowing the full weight of the revelation to sink in. I wanted her, and everyone else, to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. For weeks, I continued, my voice cutting through the stillness, I have been the target of a campaign of harassment by my tenant, Carol Peterson. A campaign based on the racist assumption that a black woman couldn't possibly afford to be her neighbor. She has abused her position on the HOA board to torment me, all while being consistently late on her rent payments to my company. Carol finally found her voice, a strangled, pathetic squeak. "That's a lie. You're lying." I didn't even look at her. I simply clicked the remote. The next slide was a table, a screenshot from the payment ledger I'd gotten from Main Street Realty. It showed the last 24 months of rent payments for 128 Azalea Lane. 18 entries were highlighted in red, showing payments received well after the due date. "The numbers, unlike people, do not lie," I said coolly. "Not only has my tenant been harassing a homeowner, she has been a material breach of her lease agreement on multiple occasions." I then turned my gaze towards the back of the room. "Mr. Davis, if you would." The nondescript man in the polo shirt stood up. He walked calmly and professionally to the front of the room, holding a long white envelope. He walked directly up to Carol, who was still standing, paralyzed by the board table. "Carol Peterson?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. She just stared at him, dumbfounded. "You have been served," he said, placing the envelope in her limp hand. He then turned, walked out of the clubhouse, and disappeared into the night. "For the record," I announced to the room, "Ms. Peterson has just been served with a legal, non-negotiable 30-day notice to vacate the property at 128 Azalea Lane. Her lease is not being renewed due to her history of late payments and, more significantly, her violation of the Community Conduct Clause, which prohibits the harassment of her neighbors. Her eviction, which she so desperately wanted from me, is now a reality for her." A wave of murmurs and whispers erupted. Carol looked down at the envelope in her hand, as if it were a venomous snake. Her face, which had been white with shock, was now flushing a deep, mottled red of pure, impotent rage and humiliation. Her reign was over. She was no longer a queen. She was just a tenant being kicked out. But I wasn't finished. This was never just about Carol. It was about the system that allowed her to flourish. I turned my attention to the rest of the board, who looked like a row of terrified mannequins. "Now," I said, my tone shifting from personal to professional, "let's talk about the real reason we're here. Let's talk about the unfounded allegations against the board." I clicked the remote again. My preliminary audit findings filled the screen. The slide on the Peterson lawn and garden contract appeared. This is a copy of a $150,000 contract for landscaping services, awarded without a competitive bid to a company owned by Carol's brother-in-law. A clear violation of our bylaws. I clicked again. The reserve fund analysis appeared. This shows that our reserve fund is critically underfunded, and the board has violated its duty to commission a timely reserve study, putting all of our property values at risk. I clicked through 2 more slides, detailing the slush funds and budgetary black holes. Then I put up my final slide, the formal demand for a forensic audit. These are not allegations, I said, my voice ringing with authority. This is evidence. Evidence of gross mismanagement, self-dealing, and a breach of the fiduciary duty you all swore to uphold. I am not a troublemaker. I am a forensic accountant, and I am a homeowner who is demanding accountability. I turn to the audience. This is your money. These are your homes. The motion to harass me is dead. I am now making a new motion, that the board be compelled to approve a full, independent forensic audit, as is our right. Furthermore, to ensure its integrity, I volunteer to lead the oversight committee for that audit, at no cost to the community. The room, which had been buzzing with shocked whispers, now erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions at the board, demanding answers. The tide of public opinion had turned into a tsunami. Carol's allies were silent, staring at their feet. Her enemies, and those who had simply been silent, were now empowered. The board, led by a pale and trembling Bob, had lost all control. The meeting had become a referendum, and they had been found guilty. Carol, forgotten for a moment, let out a sob, turned, and fled the room, leaving her public humiliation hanging in the air behind her. The aftermath of that meeting was a swift and total realignment of power in Willow Creek. The house of cards that Carol and her cronies had built collapsed in a single evening. The motion to approve the forensic audit passed with a near-unanimous vote from the floor, a public spectacle of no confidence in the board. Bob and the other 2 members who had enabled Carol resigned in disgrace within 48 hours, issuing a terse, community-wide email citing personal reasons. A temporary board was quickly appointed from a group of concerned homeowners who had approached me after the meeting, eager for transparency and change. I, as promised, led the Audit Oversight Committee. We hired a reputable independent accounting firm, not my own, to avoid any conflict of interest, and gave them the keys to the kingdom. The findings of the full audit were even more damning than my preliminary review had suggested. It uncovered years of financial sloppiness and self-serving decisions. The landscaping contract with Dale Peterson was immediately terminated, and the new board put the contract out for a proper, competitive bid. The winning company provided better service for nearly $60,000 less per year. The savings alone were enough to begin aggressively replenishing the dangerously low reserve fund. The audit also uncovered that Carol had been using the Compliance Committee discretionary fund to reimburse herself for personal expenses, including gasoline, dinners, and even her home internet bill, claiming they were all for HOA business. It was petty theft, plain and simple. The new board, on legal advice, sent her a bill for the full amount of the misappropriated funds, along with a notice that they would pursue legal action if it wasn't paid. As for Carol herself, her downfall was as pathetic as her reign had been arrogant. She made a few desperate, hysterical attempts to fight the non-renewal of her lease. She called Main Street Realty, screaming at Gerald Fleming, who simply and calmly told her the owner's decision was final. She tried to appeal to me directly, leaving a tearful, rambling voicemail on my phone that swung wildly between begging for another chance and threatening to sue me for discrimination. I never returned her call. I simply forwarded the voicemail to my lawyer and instructed Main Street Realty to communicate with her only in writing. Her 30 days passed quickly. On the last day of the month, a moving truck, much smaller and shabbier than the one I had used to move in, appeared at 128 Azalea Lane. I watched from my window as she and her browbeaten husband loaded their lives into boxes. She never once looked in the direction of my house. She, who had made it her business to stare at my home for hours, now couldn't even bear to glance at it. They were gone by nightfall, leaving behind an empty house and a legacy of disgrace. The house itself needed work. We discovered that several minor repairs reported to Main Street Realty had been ignored for years. I used the money from Carol's security deposit, and then some, to fix the leaky faucet, repair the damaged drywall in the garage, and give the whole place a fresh coat of paint. I then instructed Main Street Realty to find a new, properly vetted tenant at a slightly higher market rate rent. Life in Willow Creek changed for the better. The atmosphere of suspicion and petty tyranny evaporated. The new board was transparent and communicative. They held open meetings, published detailed financial reports, and focused on genuine community improvement rather than nitpicking residents. People started talking to their neighbors again. The welcome mat I'd been cited for was now joined by others of various colors and designs throughout the neighborhood. My unauthorized rose bushes flourished, and several neighbors asked me for cuttings. I finally had the peace I had craved. My porch became my sanctuary. I could sit with my iced tea and listen to the birds, the silence punctuated only by the friendly greetings of neighbors walking by. I had become, unintentionally, a force for positive change. People didn't treat me with fear, but with a quiet respect. I was the woman who had cleaned house, the quiet accountant who had stood up to a bully and won not with shouting or anger, but with logic, facts, and an unshakable command of the rules. In the end, the entire affair taught me a valuable lesson, one that I had always known professionally, but had now experienced personally. The most arrogant people are often the most fragile, their power built on a foundation of secrets and lies. They count on the silence and complicity of others. They count on you being too intimidated, too tired, or too scared to look closer. But the truth, like a number in a ledger, is always there, waiting to be found. All it takes is the will to start digging. The greatest power isn't in making the loudest threats, but in knowing the facts that make those threats irrelevant. Carol tried to take my home, so I took hers. But in the process, I gave the entire community back its integrity. And that was a return on investment that no spreadsheet could ever truly capture. What skills do you have, sitting dormant, that you could use to stand up to an injustice in your own life? You might be surprised at the power you hold, just waiting for the right moment to be revealed.